I thought I'd just do a small piece about Matt Hancock before running off to bed, and this long and often exasperating political saga that is Matt Hancock, whether in or out of the stationery cupboard. Oh, matron, the former health secretary whose appearances in the COVID inquiry are anything but conciliatory, in what can only be described as a tetchy and combative session. Hancock defended the government's pandemic procurement decisions with a fervour that might lead one to believe that he was the true victim of the crisis rather than the thousands of people left vulnerable by the failures that he was in charge of. And at the heart of the scrutiny was the procurement of personal protective equipment, PPE, and Hancock insisted that the UK was radically short of PPE. Well, that was partly because of Jeremy Hunt's decision to get rid of it all, and that in response to and that in response his VIP lane for suppliers with government connections was a necessary expedient. Well, nothing can explain Michelle Moon. And this practice, later ruled unlawful by the High Court, seemed in Hancock's view a mere legalistic inconvenience rather than an indictment of cronyism. The argument that the country was in an emergency and therefore anything was valid, um, uh, nothing justifies bypassing due process or bypassing basic morality. As the inquiry's commissioned expert, Professor Albert Sanchez Graus, points out, no such VIP prioritisation was found in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or indeed other nations grappling with the pandemic. Only in the stuff lauded over by Matt Hancock. And Hancock was quick to dismiss academic criticism, waving it aside with a condescending claim that researchers do not understand the reality of the moment. Well, maybe he would make the same argument when he was shuffling off into the stationery cupboard looking for an HB pencil with a rubber. Oh. But this evades the essential question: does desperation justify incompetence? I'm desperate, desperate. If the system for sourcing PPE was overwhelmed, as some officials have testified, was it because the government had no coherent plan for handling bids rather than the due sheer volume of offers? If some crooks and cranks benefited from the system, as former Minister Lord Agnu candidly admitted, why should the public have confidence that public funds were handled responsibly? They weren't. They were handled irresponsibly. And Michelle Moon is a really good example. And Hancock's and the fact that she's still stuck in the House of Lords, and she still hasn't been brought to account. I don't understand. Hancock's testimony was riddled with deflection. On the high priority lane, he distanced himself from its implementation, claiming he was simply the target of enormous amounts of conspiracy theories, yet his repeated insistence that it was standard practice contradicts the notion that he was a passive bystander. A VIP lane that disproportionately benefited politically connected businesses, many of whom had no prior experience in supplying medical equipment, was not merely a functional necessity, but a failure of government. And it's the same issues, incidentally, which which are being raised and have led to the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul today. That this is all about pandering to cronies. You can't say it's right in one place and wrong and wrong in another simply because there's a difference in geographical location. And when pressed on his communication with Alex Bourne, a pub landlord from his own constituency who miraculously landed a £30 million contract to supply COVID testing vials, Hancock said with characteristic irritation, describing the inquiry's line of questioning as wholly naive and tabloid in nature. He paints himself as a noble public servant unfairly maligned. Yet his assertion that his actions were impeccable rings hollow when one considers the perception of conflict of interest and the failure of robust due diligence. And then when you look at his sort of groping in the corner, it's as bad as the Partygate, isn't it? And it shows a man who has a hollow sense of morality. And perhaps the most baffling claim Hancock made was that the NHS was never overwhelmed. To those who have lived through the chaos of the pandemic, patients turned away from hospitals, frontline workers reusing PPE, mental health services collapsing under the strain, that claim is at best misleading and at worst offensive. And Dr. Sarah Hughes, Chief Executive of the mental health charity Mind, points out that mental health charities were already struggling before COVID-19 and the pandemic exacerbated the crisis. Testimonies from those discharged prematurely from psychiatric wards left without adequate support directly contradict Hancock's minimisation of the impact on healthcare services. And the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that not only was the NHS stretched beyond its capacity, but that it remains damaged to this day. Hancock's refusal to acknowledge this reality raises an important question. Can any meaningful lessons be learned if those responsible refuse to admit mistakes? Lord Agnu, the self-described godparent of the VIP lane, appeared at the inquiry with a rather more candid, if combative, approach. When he conceded that some crooks inevitably got through the system, he dismissed concerns over the scheme as a misconceived obsession. His analogy between his role and that of Lord Beaverbrook, who accelerated armament production during World War II, is an interesting one, but ultimately flawed. Beaverbrook's war effort didn't involve awarding lucrative contracts to politically connected firms with no history of aircraft production. It's one thing to streamline procurement in a crisis. It's quite another to abandon due diligence altogether. Agnu's testimony revealed the extent to which certain ministers saw accountability as an unnecessary burden rather than an essential safeguard. He lamented the difficulty of informing James Dyson, who spent $20 million of his own money on an ultimately futile ventilator project, that his machines were not needed. The implication that billionaires deserved a gentler rejection than the thousands of SMEs unable to get a foot in the door should concern anyone who values fairness in government decision-making. And at the end of Hancock's testimony, Baroness Hallett, the chair of the inquiry, felt compelled to remind him that the purpose of the process was not to apportion blame for its own sake, but to learn lessons for the future. One would hope that Hancock, who famously declared in his book that he should be thanked, not vilified, will reflect on this. However, given his performance at the inquiry, it seems highly unlikely. The VIP lane, the lack of preparedness, the mismanagement of PPE procurement, and the continued impact on NHS services all points to the government that was reactive rather than proactive and at times willfully blind to corruption risks. Whether those involved choose to learn from these failures is uncertain, but what is clear is that public trust was a casualty of this process. If the COVID inquiry is to achieve anything meaningful, it must cut through the self-serving narratives of those who would prefer to rewrite history in their favour. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable for Hancock and his colleagues, must be laid bare, not for political point scoring, but for the sake of the public who deserved better leadership in their time of greatest need.